Hey everyone, you're listening to the TEN7 Podcast, where we get together every fortnight, and sometimes more often, to talk about technology, business, and the humans in it. I'm your host, Ivan Stegic. In this episode of the podcast, we're following up on the Twin Cities open source CMS Unconference that happened on Saturday, October 13. And I'm happy to welcome back the organizers, Tim Erickson and Wilbur Ince. Hello.
Hello. Glad to be back.
Hey, it's good to be back, Yvonne. Thanks for having us back for another round.
You bet. I wanted to start out by saying thank you to you both. Thank you for organizing the event. Thank you for giving of yourselves freely to the greater community. Thank you for putting the time and work into creating an event that brings us slightly larger cross-section of open source in the Twin Cities together.
Glad to do it. Scratching our own itch. It's something we really wanted to do.
Yeah, I would reiterate that too. It's a labor of love to do something like this. We had a great time. It was really nice to get together with a bunch of people.
Yeah, it kind of looked like you guys were having a great time. Even though I was only able to attend the latter part of the day, it looked like you were having fun. It looked like the participants were having fun. It also looked like everyone was well caffeinated.
That's important. We had plenty of caffeine and just had a good time. People were highly engaged, and we were having great discussions.
That was good to see. So go ahead, Wilbur.
Yeah, if you've ever tried to organize these things, there's kind of the initial ramp up where you're getting everything together and working on it. And then I'm sure Tim will accept this too, the sort of the panic where it's like, oh, is everything ready? And we have to do this and that and put everything together. And then really at some point right before the conference, you realize, oh, what is going to happen here? Is anybody going to show up? Is this going to be interesting or not? And as soon as the thing got started, it was obvious that we were really, it was a good thing. It was really a lot of fun to be there and participate every minute.
So you had planned to start at around 9 a.m., and Wilbur, you just described some of the jitters I'm sure you had the night before. Tim, could you tell us how you decided you had a quorum, and what was the first thing you did as a group?
We decided before we were going to get going, we would wait, give it people at least 15 minutes. We had a relatively small group. This time we had about 15 people over the course of the day, and we had had more people register, but we wanted to give people time to show up. The first thing we did was just sort of welcomed everybody and began to describe a little bit about what our plans were for the day and what this Unconference was, because we had a number of people who showed up. Really weren't quite sure what this event was going to be, and so we wanted to sort of quickly answer their questions, and then we did some introductions.
Yeah, the start of the day, Tim and I kind of had to scramble a little because we thought we'd have a few more people there, and it got to be a smaller group. And I mean, literally at the last minute, we decided, hey, let's just do some short introductions. Let's kind of break the ice. And it was a small enough group that I think people really wanted to have those introductions. We were going to hold off on those if it was a bigger group, because it just takes a lot of time, and you'd rather have that sort of process happen organically with a larger group. But with a smaller group, we kind of backpedaled a little bit and changed our agenda a little bit. And then after our introduction, we started with a question, just kind of to try to get people in the right frame of mind to start thinking about what they wanted to do for the day. So that was an exercise where we split into two parts, and we had two people that posed questions. And I was one of them. I asked about open source software and how we incorporate it in what we do. And then the two groups spend about 10 or 15 minutes on each side and flip back and forth and talk about that. And then after the first group is done, you kind of brief the other group about what they talked about and keep going from there. So it's a nice icebreaker.
I think broadly you guys talked about like how to get more people involved in open source communities. And the other question was, is a CMS always the right answer? And right off the bat, we had two very interesting topics, and people just dove right into having very robust discussions.
And then did you guys kind of adjourn together as a main group again and separate into new tracks after that? Or kind of what was the next thing?
Yeah, in fact, we did come back together because we had yet to make our schedule. Part of the unconference model, right, is that anybody can nominate a session for the day. And we decided to do this first round of discussions to get people warmed up, get them engaged, and give them a chance to think a little bit about what the right topics would be for that day. So after we finished that first round of slightly structured discussions, we came back together, talked a little bit about, very quickly about what had happened, and then asked people to nominate the things that they wanted to talk about that day. And we sort of tried to fill up our schedule for at least the first half of the day. I think we had the first three rounds scheduled, and then we broke into our official unconference.
It felt like a really cozy number of people when I was there. And I know you didn't get all of the people that said they'd be attending compared to the number of registrations that you had. It still felt like a good number, maybe even the right number. You had two separate tracks, if you will. Do you feel like you would like to see the next unconference be bigger or about the same? How do you feel about the size that you ended up having?
When we first got started, we thought, wow, this is a kind of a small group, but it really turned into it actually wasn't. I mean, the two tracks gave us enough people in each group to have really a nice discussion. And, when you go back and look at the rules of an unconference, and the first one is the people who are here are the right people. And boy, that was really true of this group. There was never really a dead minute in these discussions. I mean, it was like, let's go to the next thing, hey, what about this thing? What about this? It really was a lively discussion. So if anything, I would say that we don't have to be afraid of having a conference with a small number of people like this. Even 15, it was really worthwhile for me, and we got a lot of feedback from other people that it was really a nice session for everybody. So I think more would be better. Maybe the top would be about 50 or 60 people, but 15 certainly seemed like a great number to have.
Sure. At least one participant vocally said he thought it was just the perfect amount, maybe a little bit more. Another participant said something along those lines, that they liked the small intimacy of it and wouldn't want to see it much bigger. So I think, having a little bit more would be nice, but the 15 was plenty to have some really good discussions. One participant said that he had more robust engagement on Saturday than he said at the last three conferences he attended.
Well, that's kudos to the unconference organizers, to you guys, for making it so interactive and getting people to engage. Congratulations. I think it was a successful day when I think back to it.
I think with that small a number, it's hard to be anonymous and hide at a conference like that. Sometimes when you go to a conference, you can sit in the back and work on a project and only half listen to the discussion. But with this one, it was like I say, hard to hide. Everybody was right there, and when people talked about something, they looked around the circle, and if you were distracted on your phone, it was obvious.
Yeah, that's a nice side effect, I think. I want to reflect a little bit about or on the makeup of the conference attendees. Both of you did a very good and admirable job of reaching across the aisle, so to speak, and trying to get people who are not just Drupal involved in the event. I know that there was a risk that it might seem like a Drupal-heavy Unconference, so to speak. How did that play out? Tim, maybe you have some thoughts on that.
Sure. Wilbur and I talked about it. I think in terms of planning the event, the one thing we would do differently is to engage some folks, get some people heavily invested in helping us with the outreach in other communities. That's going to work better than having us try to reach out to people that in the communities that we're not so familiar with. I think we did have a surge of like WordPress folks register at the last minute and then not show up. I think part of getting them was that we sort of at a late moment gotten somebody prominent in the WordPress community that was sort of excited about the event and advocating, but then for personal reasons he couldn't come, and I think the fact that a lot of them had just heard about it very late meant that despite their interest, they weren't able to be there. But if we had had those people involved earlier and doing the outreach in their own communities, I think that would have helped a lot. Yeah, it was. We had a good mix of people. We had a prominent Joomla contributor there. We had at least a couple of active WordPress people there. We had a gentleman who primarily uses Concrete 5. So we were able to have really good discussions across platforms, but having a little more diversity would be good. The other diversity we lacked was we were all men, which was unfortunate. Yeah, it was 100% male, and that was not something I like to see. And we certainly tried to reach out to a variety. I was personally inviting a lot of people, and I tried to invite personally a diverse group of people, but didn't work out.
And it'd be wonderful if it wasn't 100% men in attendance. I think there is a lot we can all do in all aspects of our communities to make things more inclusive and more inviting. I saw on the board at the Unconference that I don't think we talked about in the last podcast and that I had seen for the first time was Butterfly versus Bumblebee. Can you tell me what that is? Is it the description of how you behave in the Unconference? What was that?
Sure. In addition to we have the rules of an Unconference, the law of 2 feet, and then there are two special sort of roles that are sometimes talked about. And they're the butterfly and the bumblebee. And the bumblebee the idea is that's somebody who sort of moves from session to session, doesn't necessarily sit in one place, and brings ideas from one group to another. And I think it's hard to be a bumblebee in that small of a group. If we had 4 or 5 sessions going on simultaneously, having some people that sort of walk between them and bring ideas with is a great role. The butterfly is the person who just kind of hangs out in the meadow or by the coffee machine and has conversations, with whoever else they encounter. I found a saying that said if two butterflies meet at the coffee cooler, they might have the best discussion of the day. The idea of throwing those things out there is to remind people that there are different roles you can play and to be interactive.
Do you have a favorite session that you attended, Wilbur?
Yeah, I can tell you that later in the day, we got into a session and we talked about dev tools, environments, miscellaneous technology was the name of that session. And it was just kind of a round robin session where we just sort of went from thing to thing, and people would ask, "What do you use for this? What do you do with that? How do you sync files?" And we just went from actual apps you're using on your phone or your computer to operating systems to development tools to debugging tools. And of course, we had a real open source flavor to this thing, but it was just really cool to pick everyone's brains and to be picked. And for me, that was the best session, to kind of find out really what's out there in the real world and what's getting used.
I heard you guys even talking about furniture. Stand-up desks,
ergonomics, stand-up desks. What do you need to be productive? That's what we talked about.
So my favorite session was Floss governance. I'm all about the governance and community building and stuff. And somebody came in from the WordPress community that was very frustrated with how decisions are being made. I think one of the things that was, for a lot of us in the Drupal community, we got a good chance to hear about some of the controversy going around in the WordPress community around the launch of Gutenberg. And there's some stress about that and how the decision was made. And this person was looking to hear about how other open source communities are making decisions, and how the WordPress community might be able to improve that process. And we had a really robust conversation about that, talking about, I got to hear more about how Joomla decisions are made in Joomla, Backdrop, Drupal, and I think WordPress were the main ones we talked about. And I'm very familiar with Drupal and Backdrop, but I had really no idea about WordPress and Joomla.
What's the high-level understanding, quick description of the Gutenberg issue that you alluded to?
Okay, do you want to do it, Wilbur?
Yeah, I'll take a go at it, and you can correct me, Tim.
maybe not.
Actually, I think the controversy is that the Gutenberg Editor is coming in, and the implementation of that feels like it's a little forced, and it's being kind of pushed through as the next feature. And there's some questions about accessibility with that, and the community is upset about that. Well, half of the community is upset about that they're not getting adequate access to the process, and that this is going to be a big mess when this thing comes down. And so I think that's kind of the real controversy about this, and how this is going to get implemented, and sort of how it plays out, nuts and bolts about accessibility.
I think that was a good job, Wilbur, as far as I don't understand it well, but the main thing seems to be that it's being very much forced on the community and quicker than some people would like. There's a lot of people that are excited and really happy with it, but we were hearing from some folks that, were frustrated with the process.
And the processes are different in all these other communities. It sounds like the person who brought that issue up was able to learn from maybe what we do in Drupal and what happens in other communities as well.
Yeah, one of the things that surprised me, that we had a gentleman from the Joomla community who really described their process, which I think is the most different. They have no benevolent dictator for life, as we do in both Drupal and WordPress. It's a very community-driven process. We talked a little bit about the Backdrop process that has a project management committee, although the Apache mode. Is that right? I think it is. So we talked about a couple of different ways that it's done.
It's surprising to me that there are so many different ways to do these things. Well, I guess maybe not surprising. We're all different communities, but you would think that there'd be a best practice that eventually evolved over the course of 20 years. I mean, that's sometimes how things work out. And maybe that's what we should strive for.
I think more events like this could help that. I remember talking to Angie Byron once and said, how often do we as a community get out and talk to other communities about things like governance? And my recollection was, that she admitted not often enough that we get have a lot of internal discussions, but don't talk enough to each other across communities. And I think that's where the value of an unconference like this comes in. We get a chance to talk to each other.
And there seemed to be a lot of, at least I kind of felt that it was a very safe space where people were free to speak their mind. They were free to talk about what their experiences were and listen to others. So I generally got the idea that there was a great acceptance from the participants on the success of the unconference. Can you speak to, Tim, kind of what's next? Are we going to see another unconference soon? Are there any similar kinds of events that you might be organizing with Wilbur, or that you feel like the community wants? What's your thoughts on that?
Sure. So the first thing that was next was just going out for a beer and playing a board game and chilling out. But we had some discussions in the final session about what people thought we should do in the future. There was absolute strong interest in other events like this, cross-community sort of unconference-y types events. people definitely like the format and want to see more of this kind of format, and they like that cross-disciplinary type thing. We haven't made a firm decision on what comes next. I personally feel pretty strongly committed to doing something. Another unconference like this. One idea that came up was something called IndyCamp, I think. And the idea was that we do sort of an unconference like this, but focus the outreach on people who are just building websites. So either individuals, small businesses, nonprofits that are looking to build a website and have questions about how to do that, and that there would be web designers and developers there as well, but that we would be talking about the problems and the challenges that users face in managing and building websites, and then addressing it from that perspective. I think that could be a really cool idea. I definitely would want to see the same cross-spectrum of platforms all represented, and maybe some others. Wilbur and I have also talked about maybe doing an evening meetup where we try to work through, where we actually do some structured demos on the various different open source CMSs. So we'd love feedback on this. The initial idea is maybe we do a couple of evening presentations where we get 3 people representing 3 different CMSs to each get up and give a 20-minute demo, and then do a Q&A after that, and maybe do that once a month until we get through all the open source CMSs.
I would love to see that. In fact, I had an idea as you were talking that sprung to mind. The last session was not the wrap-up session, but the CMS Throwdown session that happened at the end of the unconference made me think of kind of mini demo, and your idea of having a demo night for CMSs I think that's very interesting. I almost feel like 20 minutes with a prepared presentation is too long. I almost feel like but you would consider doing a mini demo style night where someone picks their favorite CMS, but they're not allowed to use slides. They're not allowed to have a prepared presentation, and they only get 5 minutes to demo how the CMS works and all of the best features. And that way you might be able to get through 10 of them or 15 of them in one night.
That sounds like a good idea, but you got to try and find these people that are kind of representative of these different platforms. It was kind of interesting talking with everybody during that Throwdown session that people kind of had their preferred tools that they had used or CMSs they had used, and because of the nature of these things, it takes a lot of commitment to know these kind of tools, and so nobody knew more than really 2 or 3 of them in any detail, and so. I would have, after being in that session, I would almost be interested in having a structured session where you would really get a real concrete demonstration by somebody that would be like, here's this tool, and here's where it's strong, and here's where it's weak, and that you could even have the presenters share their slides so that a person could go to an event like that and really get a really accurate consideration of these tools back to back, and then be able to ask them questions, And so maybe 4 or 5 of those in a night, 20 minutes or a half hour with Q&A after would be, for me, that would be interesting. But I'm not trying to poo-hoo your idea of kind of a speed dating throwdown, but I'd love to go deep on something like that, and that's kind of what we miss, because people would talk about things and somebody would ask a question and they said, I'm not sure, I don't know that CMS that well.
I think both formats could work well, and I'm intrigued by both, so I definitely see the value of digging deeper, but I also like Yvonne's idea.
I would love to see a throwdown again, quite honestly. Maybe that's why I thought of the 5 minutes for each. But I see the value of going deep into something as well. At that point, maybe 20 minutes isn't enough.
The throwdown was fun, and that kind of came up spontaneously. We had a little bit of time at the end of the day, and one of the participants said, hey, we haven't had that yet. And to be clear, for those who weren't there, The Throwdown sounds a little more aggressive and confrontational than it was. Basically, we just sort of went around the room and let people talk about their favorite CMS and what sort of makes it stand out from the others. And we covered, I think, pretty well Drupal, Backdrop, I think WordPress got underrepresented at that time of the day, but Joomla and Concrete 5 were the ones I think we covered. Oh, and Grav, that was a file-based CMS.
Yeah, I'd never heard of Grav before. I'm glad I was there. I did some research afterwards and was happy to find that it's easy to use and might even use it for some personal projects in the future. It kind of looks interesting. What do you think you guys would do differently the next time you do this kind of an event?
Tim and I we're excited to do this project, and we thought, hey, let's just get this done and let's make it happen. And I think in our haste, we picked up the ball and we ran with it, but we made a classic error about including other communities. And that was the whole point of this, was trying to reach out to other communities. And our organizational technique was wrong from the start. It shouldn't have been two Drupal-centric devs going at organizing open source conference. We should have had somebody there from, we should have a key person as a WordPress developer or organizer. We should have had somebody from, Joomla. We should have had Michael more involved. And really to get buy-in from those other communities, and really to let them do their magic and go out and reach their community and bring people in. And so it's just a classic sort of inclusion error that we make, right? That we look too much alike and we need to find other people, and that's going to influence our process and change. Maybe, like, we know how we do Drupal events, but how do Joomla events happen, and how would that have affected the process? So for the next, our work right now is to start organizing the next conference, which is going to be about organizing other groups and having their say in how this thing works the next time around.
One other thing that I'm not sure if we would do differently, but I want to talk more about is whether or not a weekend is the time to do this, or whether or not there would be a different audience for this on a weekday. I don't know. It's just something to think about, because I think there's a whole group of people that just aren't going to give up a Saturday for this, but would love to participate.
Yeah, that's the classic conundrum, isn't it? You have some companies and some agencies where the Friday of the week works really well because you can take that day off and you could use your professional development time. And then some organizations and some people can't make it during the week at all because they don't have access to that kind of thing. So weekends work better for them. And then there's yet another group where weekends are sacred to family time. And so you don't want to spend any time on the weekend doing, quote unquote, your job. So it's a tough thing to balance, I think. I guess you can experiment and iterate.
Agreed.
Yeah, to be fair too, there's another aspect of the conference that I really thought was nice, and that was that we had people of different levels and abilities there. We had some new devs that were like asking questions about how do you do this? How do you build clients? How do you estimate business? We had hardcore back-end developers. We had front-end developers there. So in that small group, we had a pretty good mix.
Project managers. We really had that was a really good microcosm of the development world at our little camp there, and that was really fun to hear other people talk about their side of these things.
Now that you've done this unconference, how do you think your attitude towards TC Drupal Camp, the next camp that we have coming up in the Drupal community here in the Twin Cities, how do you think your view has been influenced, or has it been influenced, as to whether or not the camp itself might consider changing formatting, changing programming?
That's a loaded question. So,
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to ask a loaded question.
It's okay. I like loaded questions. I have been a strong advocate for experimentation and trying new things for a while. And there's been some growing interest, I think, in like trying to build maybe an unconference-y portion into our camp in some way. But the camp has got a lot of momentum in a large group of people that are involved in. And I think large dramatic changes in our camp are hard. So one of the things that came out of last year's camp was let's experiment in some other ways. And I think part of the reason we did this event was to experiment with it. And it's not just up to us, but other people on the committee that were there on Saturday. You know, it would be interesting to see how their mind has changed. I'd definitely like to see experimentation and ways of incorporating this, but we got to convince more people.
You know, the whole idea of this camp came from a session that I attended with Michael Babker, who's the Joomla guy that was there at our unconference. And I think after going through this, I think it will be a lot easier for Tim and I and people that were at the conference to identify things that would be of value to other developers. And we certainly provide those sessions as part of our camp. And I think now that we kind of see this, we can make a value argument to people and say, hey, right, this is a Drupal camp, but come and it's a software camp, and you'll find out about local development. You'll find out about other sessions that can potentially be part of that program, and that would be interesting. And right, we have a 4-day camp for $35 or $50, right? It's a great value, and I think people could we could really sell that, and so we might want to think about that.
I just wanted to add that in addition to sort of the idea of like incorporating more unconference into the camp, I think the other different idea that we did was the cross-platform. And I think there has been growing interest over the last couple of years about figuring out some ways that our camp can collaborate with the Twin Cities WordPress camp in particular. With this session, we might have broadened that out even more. And I think that's definitely an idea. You know, forget about the unconference for a minute, but just the idea about how the TC Drupal camp could cross-promote, cross-program, or even, you know, work WordPress into our camp is something that a lot of people are interested in.
I like that idea of cross-pollination and getting communities that are so similar together, and maybe there's a WordPress track in the TC Drupal camp. Maybe another possibility is having 1 day of camp and 1 day of unconference. You can kind of, I guess, almost halve the amount of work you need to do to organize. Or maybe it's not half, but it's certainly less organization where you have to have 1 day of programming as opposed to 2, and you have an unconference on one of the 2 days. But that's just me spitballing. I certainly would defer to other opinions as well.
I think they're good ideas.
So, you know, Yvonne, with that, it sounds like you might be a great person to be one of the organizers for camp this year.
Good call, Wilbur.
That's a very good call. Yes, I will certainly evaluate that, and we'll see what we can do. All in all, good unconference, lots of positive feedback. What are next steps you're doing with the attendees? Is there going to be a survey of some sort? I thought I saw you mention that, or hear you mention that at the wrap session.
We talked about two things, one of which was actually surveying those who sort of signed up and didn't come to get a better sense of why they didn't come, because they obviously had an interest but weren't able to make it, and a better sense from them about whether location, day of the week, or what was an issue. We got some pretty good feedback from the people who were there. And I mean, one of the exciting things to see is that the people who came in the morning, most of them were still there at the end of the day. A few people had to leave early, but so we had pretty good feedback in that sense. The other thing we wanted to do was we have some notes, and I've asked some other people to go back and fill in those notes about what happened that day. And I'd like to get those out to all the participants and just give them a chance to sort of review them and maybe share those with the people who weren't able to attend as well.
When do you expect to be sending that info out?
The next couple of days.
Okay, that's wonderful. Tim and Wilbur, thank you so much for spending your time with me again.
Thanks for having us. It was fun.
Yeah, thanks for getting the word out, and thanks for coming and participating. It was a great session.
It was wonderful seeing you. Tim Erickson, you are St. Paul Tim on Twitter. That's St. Paul Tim on Twitter. Wilbur Ince, you're Wilbur on Twitter. That's WYLBUR. And the Unconference has its own handle as well, and that's TCOSCMS on Twitter. Gentlemen, thank you for your time. You've been listening to the TEN7 Podcast. Find us online at ten7.com/podcast. And if you have a second, do send us a message. We love hearing from you. Our email address is podcast@ten7.com. Until next time, this is Ivan Stegic. Thank you for listening.